Hey everyone, I'm Paul, and in this video I'm installing a limited slip rear differential in my 1997 Toyota RAV4. Most cars have open differentials. A differential has a pinion gear connected to the drive shaft. The pinion gear drives the big ring gear and differential carrier. Side gears are connected to the axles that go to the wheels, and there are spider gears in the middle. The spider gears don't move when you drive in a straight line. When going around a curve, the spider gears turn and allow the axles to turn at different speeds. That's why it's called a differential. The RAV4 has all-wheel drive. Basically, it's a front-wheel drive car with a transversely mounted engine and transmission. The front-wheel drive transmission has a differential attached to it that sends power to the back of the car. The RAV4 has a differential in front, in the back, and one between the transmission and drive shaft. That means the RAV4 has 3 differentials, and they're all open differentials. The center differential can be locked with the push of a button if you have the manual transmission version. The automatic RAV4 uses a viscous coupling for the center differential that acts kind of like an automatic lock. The RAV4 is not 4-wheel drive. Trucks will have a longitudinally mounted engine and transmission in a rear-wheel drive configuration. For 4-wheel drive to work, a transfer case is added between the transmission and drive shaft. 4-wheel drive vehicles have a total of 2 differentials, and there is no center differential. The transfer case will also have a low-range gear for rock crawling and going up steep hills. The problem with having 3 open differentials is each wheel is allowed to turn a different speed. That includes 3 of the wheels not turning at all. If you get one wheel in the air, the car won't move. I lifted the left rear wheel in the air with the jack to demonstrate how this works. If one wheel has 0 traction, the RAV4 will get stuck even though the other 3 wheels are on pavement. When I rev up the engine, the car tries to move because the spider gears in the differential have a tiny bit of resistance, but it still can't apply enough torque to the other wheels to move the car. If you apply the parking brake, it will add resistance to the wheel that is in the air, and the differential will send some torque to the other side. With the center differential lock on, the front wheels will get torque and the RAV4 will move. The first generation RAV4 is known for having a big clunk in the back when you go into gear or drop the clutch. This is caused by the rear differential mount being too soft and allowing too much up and down movement in the differential. Now let's test it in the snow. The front wheels and right rear wheel have good traction, but the left rear wheel is barely touching the wet pavement. I have some traction, but because all the differentials are open, all the torque goes to the left rear wheel and the car is stuck. Time to swap out the differential. The rear CV axles are held on by 4 nuts. Use the parking brake to hold it and turn the axle to access the other nuts. The right side is the same, with the exhaust pipe being slightly in the way. After you remove the nuts, pull the axle away from the differential and slide it past the pipe. The drive shaft is attached to the differential with 4 bolts and 4 nuts. Put the transmission in gear to keep the drive shaft from turning. You can use an impact driver to save some time after you loosen the nut with a wrench. Remove all 4 bolts and hit the drive shaft like a caveman until it falls off. The bolts that hold the differential onto the mount take a shallow 17mm socket. There is not enough clearance to use a U-joint and power tools. The socket just kept coming off. Perhaps one of those wobble sockets would do the job. I don't have that tool, so I just had to do it with the wrench. Once the bolts are partly out, the shallow socket doesn't fit. Moving on to the back, the rear differential mount is held onto the unibody with 2 bolts. Hold the differential with the jack and take them out. Gently lower the differential, or drop it, whatever you want to do. Okay, it's out of the car. Let's move over to the workbench and take a closer look. This rear mount is terrible, and it isn't even broken. I bought it new from Toyota when I replaced my suspension. They're just really flimsy. 2 big bolts attach the mount to the differential. I added Loctite to them, so I need the air impact wrench. Now let's take a look inside the old differential. Alright, let's get that oil out of the way and compare the open differential to the limited slip differential. When the drive shaft turns, the ring gear and carrier turn, and so do the axles. If you hold one side, the spider gears will turn to allow the torque to go to the other side. When you spin the axles, the gears inside make noise. The TORSEN limited slip differential behaves exactly the same way on the bench, and you actually can't tell them apart while the cover is still on. The internal gears are a lot quieter on the limited slip differential. Let's take a closer look at the open diff. The pinion gear has 14 teeth and the ring gear has 41 teeth. The final drive ratio is 2.928. The spider gears are noisy. There isn't much play when I turn the gears, but the axles can move in and out a lot. The TORSEN limited slip differential looks a lot nicer. It's hard to see what's inside, but there are a lot more gears than the open differential. If I turn the drive shaft and hold one axle, the other side will turn, just like the open diff. This one makes less noise when the axles spin opposite directions, and it feels like it has less play in the gears inside. When I pull the axles in and out, there's about 4 times less movement. The case hides pretty much everything inside, but that also makes this differential very strong. It can handle 900 horsepower. Just kidding, I don't know that, and you actually want to measure torque, not horsepower. But you can definitely swap in any engine you want and run tons of boost, and this differential won't break. Check out this video about the TORSEN differential. When driving down the road in a straight line, the gears inside the differential don't turn, and both axles go the same speed. When going around a curve, the wheels need to turn at different speeds, and the gears inside the differential will turn. In this way, the TORSEN differential acts just like an open differential. The difference is the gears inside have a different ratio than the spider gears and create torque biasing. When a wheel with less traction begins to spin, a multiple of that amount of torque is sent to the other side. For example, you might get 3 times more torque to the wheel that has traction. In this video by Lessix, they explain the gears as worm gears that lock, but that's not true. Tech Damon explains how this works in the comments. It's important to know the differential multiplies torque from one side to the other. If a wheel is in the air and has 0 traction, 0 times 3 is still 0, and the car will get stuck anyway. The TORSEN limited slip differential is great in snow or mud, but will not help with rock crawling when you have a wheel in the air. On the outside, these differentials look the same. Some people say the LSD has a number 2 stamped into it, but so does the open diff. If you look at the back cover, the LSD says 17SA2-2, and the open differential cover says 17SA2-1. That's a difference I found, but I don't know if that actually means anything. The TORSEN differential has a part number stamped into it, and the open differential does not. Both differentials have a 2.928 gear ratio. The one on the left came out of my 1997 manual transmission RAV4, and the one on the right came out of a 1999 with an automatic. I believe all the first and second gen RAV4s had the same rear differentials. The limited slip differential is very rare and came as a factory option in the RAV4. If you're lucky, you might find one at a junkyard. Most junkyards will let you search their inventory on their website. Pull and Save in West Valley has 3 first-gen RAV4s. Let's check out the green 1998 RAV4. Copy the VIN and go to the Toyota Vehicle Specification website. You'll probably have to make a login. Paste the VIN here and look it up. Here we have a 1998 RAV4. Green, and Toyota says it's green. Scroll down to look at the standard installation equipment. If it has the limited slip differential, it will be listed here under Mechanical and Performance. This one doesn't have it. Next, the 2000 silver RAV4. Also doesn't have the differential. Okay, how about the 1996 red one? Also no limited slip. And these are the options on my RAV4. Mine's a 1997. Also did not come with the LSD. Obviously I found one, but I didn't save the VIN from that car. This is me at the junkyard. Step 1, check the VIN to make sure the car has the LSD. Step 2. Remove it from the car. Step 3. Open it to check. And this is me being stoked about it. Yes. I need to reinstall the cover, so I'm removing the old sealant with a wire wheel. I'm applying a thin coat of silicone sealer to the differential case. Make sure to get sealant around the bolt holes and try to keep it out of where the oil goes. I applied a thin coat to the cover too. Gently install the cover and all the bolts. I'm only going finger tight on the bolts right now. I'll torque them later. According to the directions on the silicone sealer, you need to wait 1 hour before torquing the bolts. This gives the sealer some time to dry before you smash it down. You should also wait 24 hours for the sealant to fully cure before you add oil. The differential cover bolts get torqued to 34 foot-pounds or 46 Newton meters. Next, I want to remove the differential front mount. It's held on by 2 nuts, but there isn't enough room to pull it out because it hits the gas tank. The rear subframe needs to come down. There are 2 nuts in front. I had some trouble getting one of them off because the bolt started spinning. The back of the subframe is held by 2 bolts. Support the subframe with the jack so it doesn't fall down, and take out the last bolt. The exhaust pipe is in the way, so I'm disconnecting it from the muffler so it can move down. The gasket here is the Felpro 23626. The tie rods are still holding the subframe, so I pushed it down with my jack handle, then removed the differential mount. The differential front mount has 2 rubber bushings that can flex up and down. The bolt moves very easily up and down, but it's stiff side to side. When you put the car in gear and go, the entire differential can twist the same direction the axles do. This is the original mount from 1997 with 160,000 miles. It looks like the rubber is starting to crack only a little bit. I think this mount is still good. This is a brand new mount from Toyota. It feels the same as the old mount. I don't feel a difference in stiffness up and down or side to side. Here's a closer look at the rubber in there. It's attached at the sides, but not at the top and bottom. Looking at the rear mount, the rubber is only attached on one side, and it allows a lot of movement. I'm holding it upside down. The differential basically sits on the rubber, and the top is not attached. I ordered a new front mount from Toyota Parts Deal, and the rear mount is also new. I bought it 4 years ago. I get all my parts diagrams from parts.toyota.com. Enter your vehicle information, then select the category. Scroll down until you find the diagram you need. This is the rear axle housing and differential. Okay, let's make it bigger. Here are the part numbers from Toyota for the differential mounts and bolts. Toyota supersedes old part numbers with new ones. Supersede is just a confusing way to say update or replace. For example, the rear mount, 52380C, is now 52380-42082. The next step is filling the differential mounts. The rear mount has a metal cover. It's not needed, and the 2nd Gen RAV4 doesn't come with a cover. I'm using the Dremel tool with a milling bit to clean up the rubber and cut out the thin layer that doesn't do anything. This is how the rear mount looks after I cleaned it. Notice the rubber is only attached at 2 points. I ordered 3M window weld on Amazon. This is a polyurethane adhesive and sealant designed for gluing a new windshield to your car. Begin by filling one side of the mount with polyurethane. I want it to be flat and look good, so I applied clear plastic wrap and smoothed it out with my fingers. Add polyurethane to the other side and make sure to completely fill all the gaps. Once this side is done, cover it with clear plastic wrap. I used a grinder cutoff wheel as a flat surface to even out the polyurethane. The clear plastic is preventing this process from turning into a huge mess. Pull the plastic off to reveal a smooth and even polyurethane-filled differential mount. I removed the plastic after only a few minutes because leaving it on can prevent the polyurethane from drying. The differential front mount has much smaller gaps. Fill one side with sealant, add plastic, and even it out. Fill the other side, add plastic, and smooth out the polyurethane with your fingers. I filled the big rear mount and both the old and new front mounts with polyurethane and still had some left in the tube. Polyurethane adhesive can be used in 1 hour and fully cures in 24 hours when applied in a thin layer to a windshield. Filling the differential mounts creates a much thicker layer, so I recommend allowing it to dry for 1 week before installing it in the car. After drying, you can feel the polyurethane has a little bit of squish to it, but it's very hard to move the bolt in any direction. It's a lot stiffer than before. I filled the old differential mount with polyurethane as well. I don't need it, so I'll probably sell it. The rear mount is completely filled and I can't move the center part at all with my fingers. This will be much better than before. Before I install the new differential, I have a few small things I want to fix. I'm not very smart, but you guys watching the videos are. And shout out to username in the comments for telling me I installed my shocks wrong. The rear shocks come with 2 rubber bushings and no instructions on where they go. You get 2 bushings and 3 washers. If you pay attention when taking your car apart, this isn't a problem, but my suspension project took forever, so I forgot. Okay, this little washer shouldn't be touching the metal unibody. Instead, it goes inside the car. The diagram on the left shows how a shock gets mounted to a car. The bushings touch the metal unibody, and the metal washers don't. That's how you make the shocks quiet, so they don't clunk. The Old Man Emu shocks come with 3 washers, so I'm moving the extra washer inside the car. That way the lower rubber bushing is touching the metal unibody. My rear suspension has been clunking a bit, so I'm trying to figure out why. The rear springs have a rubber insulator between the top of the spring and the unibody. The bottom of the spring sits directly on the cast iron trailing arm. The trailing arm tilts at an angle as the suspension moves through its travel. My theory is when the suspension tops out, the spring moves a little bit and causes some noise where it touches the trailing arm. My spray paint has worn off in this area, so I'm sanding it, cleaning it with alcohol, and doing a little bit of touch-up paint to prevent rust. That looks a lot better. The bottom part of the spring has a gap in the coil, and the top of the spring is flattened. This nice rubber spring insulator fits perfectly on top of the spring. Toyota doesn't sell a rubber thing for the bottom of the spring, so I'm going to make one myself out of 3/4 inch rubber heater hose. Installing a rubber hose on the spring is just an invitation for water to get trapped and have the spring rust out, so I'm coating the spring with grease first. This also makes it easier to slide the hose over the spring. I don't want water getting into the ends of the hose, so I'm cleaning off the grease just in these 2 spots and adding silicone sealer. I added a layer of grease to the upper spring insulator too, just in case the spring wants to get rusty up there. Now I need to get the spring into position and line up the bottom coil with the indent in the trailing arm. Use the jack to push up on the trailing arm until the spring is in position. As you compress the spring, the top part will go into its hole a little bit better. It never lines up perfectly, but that's just how these old RAV4s are. The spring wants to be a straight line, and the trailing arm isn't parallel to the unibody. Okay, the bottom of the spring is seated correctly, and so is the top. The top of the shock has the rubber bushing touching the metal unibody. This washer fits nicely up here, and the stepped part helps center the shock. I'm installing the rubber bushing next, followed by the other washer. The Old Man Emu shock has a flat part you can hold with vice grips while tightening the nut. Okay, and that part is done. On the left side of the car, the bottom part of the coil spring ends in a different spot. Both left and right springs are the same. And of course the rubber shock bushing is touching the shock mount on the car. It's time to bolt the rear subframe back into position. It's held in by 2 bolts and 2 nuts. I had some trouble with one of the bolts spinning. The bolt is pressed into the washer and mine came loose. Let's put it back in and weld it just a little bit. I painted the bolt to prevent rust and locked the washer back in place. Pry the subframe down with a jack handle and reinstall the front differential mount. The curved part goes up because the differential goes under the mount. Reinstall the 2 nuts that hold the differential mount. I tighten them with my electric impact driver and I'll torque them later. I'm raising both spindles in the car to compress the springs a little bit. I'll have to fight the suspension to get the subframe as high as it needs to be, so I'm actually making it easier by moving the spindles up. I decided it's easier with these bolts out. Use the jack to raise the subframe. Stop when it's about 1/4 inch away from the unibody. The suspension tie rods are pulling the subframe back, so I had to push it forward with my foot to line up the bolts. Make sure you can push the bolt straight up and the impact driver can turn the bolt easily. You want to avoid cross-threading the mounting bolts and nuts. Turn the bolts until they stop, then back them up just a little bit so the subframe can still move. Install the 2 front bolts. They're easy to access when you pull up the rear carpet. Make sure both bolts go through the holes in the subframe and push the subframe the rest of the way up with the jack. Install the nut, but don't tighten it yet. The subframe needed just a little more help from my foot to get the last bolt lined up. With every nut and bolt installed, I can go back and tighten all four. The subframe mounting bolts and nuts take a 17mm socket and get torqued to 74 foot-pounds or 100 Nm. Don't forget to torque the two differential mount nuts, same torque. I'm ready to install the rear differential mount. Bolt it onto the differential first. These are the two big coarse thread bolts. My impact driver doesn't go very tight, and I'll torque these bolts later. The rear differential case is cast iron with big steel gears inside, so it's heavy. Don't try to muscle it in there, and let the jack do the heavy lifting instead. You still have to line up the rear mounting bolts, and that's much harder if you don't have the jack holding it up for you. Push the muffler out of the way and start the bolts by hand. These are the bolts with the big fat washers. Get the second bolt installed. I'll torque these later. Insert the long bolts that hold the front of the differential. Push the differential up by hand to line up the holes. Once both bolts are threaded in a few turns, you don't need the jack. There isn't enough room to get a socket in here, so I had to turn each bolt a million times by hand with a wrench. Once the bolts are all the way in, a shallow socket does fit. Torque these ones to 98 foot-pounds or 133 Nm. I'm ready to reconnect the exhaust pipe. You'll probably need new bolts and a new gasket. Since the only thing I ever do with my car is take it apart and put it back together instead of driving it, my exhaust parts are still in good condition. These bolts get torqued to 35 foot-pounds. I personally don't think the torque wrench is necessary for every single bolt, and I can feel if it's tight enough, but since I'm making a tutorial video, I'm going to include all the torque specs for you. Don't forget to fill the differential with gear oil. Always take the fill plug out first. You can use 3 different tools for this. 10mm and 3/8 inch are the same size, and the T55 Torx works great if the fill plug is very rusty. The drain plug can be removed with a 24mm socket or 15/16. They are also the same size. Make sure the copper washer comes off. I bought new plugs but forgot to buy new washers, so I'm reusing it. Buying a new copper washer is more important than buying a new plug. Tighten the drain plug. 36 foot-pounds is not very tight. Now it's time to fill it with oil. Use 75W90 synthetic gear oil. The TORSEN limited slip differential is just a bunch of gears and doesn't have clutches, so it takes the same oil as an open diff. Special additives are not needed here. I bought this gear oil filler hose at the auto parts store. It works great. Notice I'm filling the differential before I installed the axles. That's smart, right? The axles are not in the way. The differential will take one full bottle and a little bit out of the second bottle. The fluid will spill back out of the fill plug when it's full. Reinstall the fill plug and torque to 36 foot-pounds. The inner CV axle joints can move in and out. Push them toward the wheel away from the differential and slide the holes over the studs. Install the lock washers and nuts. Rotate the axle to reach the other nuts. Use the parking brake to prevent the axle from turning and torque the nuts to 41 foot-pounds. Release the brake, rotate the axle 180 degrees, set the brake, torque the other 2 nuts. You can save some time by using the electric impact driver, but keep in mind it can't torque the bolts and you still have to do that by hand. Use the parking brake to keep the axle from spinning. If you look closely, you'll see I marked the studs with red and blue Sharpie markers to keep myself organized. Finally, the drive shaft goes back in. Line up the mounting plate and holes, and push it into place. Install the nails to hold the drive shaft. Just kidding, I know they're not nails, but I like using a hammer, damn it! Install all 4 bolts, then get the lock washer and nuts. Hold each nut with a wrench while turning the bolt with a torque wrench. Putting the car in gear will stop the drive shaft from turning with a manual transmission. Or put it in park if you have an automatic. Torque all the bolts, then go back and do them all a second time to make sure. When you have a mounting plate with multiple bolts, torquing the last bolts can make the first bolts loose as the metal parts are pressed together. I'm done with the differential, but while I have the rear wheels off, let's adjust the rear brakes. If you can pull the parking brake lever high, the rear brakes are too loose. I got 7 clicks, which is good, but I can tighten them a little more. The rear drum brakes work by pressing brake shoes against the inside of the drum. The shoes need to be moved closer to the drum as they wear down and get thinner. Turning the adjuster wheel down moves the brake shoes out and tightens the brake. Lift up the ratcheting mechanism and turn the wheel the other way to loosen the brake and move the shoes away from the drum. The rear brake drum has a hole for adjusting the brake. I'm going to tighten it a few clicks to see if the drum still turns. It's normal for the brake to drag a little, but it should be easy to turn. I just made it too tight, and the drum is hard to turn, even with 2 hands. To loosen the brake, use the small screwdriver to push the flat metal ratchet away from the toothed wheel and turn the wheel the other way. It's easier to turn it in this direction because the springs want to pull the shoes away from the drum. Now I can turn the spindle. It drags a little, but it's easy to turn and doesn't get stuck. Make sure to adjust both sides. Now the parking brake handle is hard to pull up, and I can only get 4 clicks. Having a tight parking brake is important for parking the car on a hill, but it also makes sure you have the correct balance between front and rear brakes. If the parking brake is too loose, the hydraulic rear brakes also won't work well, and braking will be biased too much to the front. You might not notice on dry pavement, but it can cause you to spin out and lose control while braking in the rain or snow. To install the tires, I like to sit on the ground and use my feet to move the wheel. It's very easy to lift that way and line up the lug nuts. Make sure to start all the lug nuts by hand. It's okay to tighten the lug nuts with a small electric impact driver. The big half-inch drive impact wrenches will over-tighten the lug nuts, so don't use them for assembly. This little quarter-inch drive tool only goes to about 30 foot-pounds, so I can't mess it up. The final tightening should be done by hand. Use the parking brake to stop the wheel from turning, or just set the car on the ground.
I'm going to test the limited slip rear differential with one wheel in the air. Here I can spin it freely, and I can't tell the difference between this and an open differential by doing this, because it doesn't have clutches inside. It actually just has gears. So with one wheel in the air, theoretically it's going to behave exactly the same as an open differential. I've got the center diff lock off, and I'm not going to use the parking brake. I'm just going to get in there and see what happens. Okay, so with one wheel in the air and the limited slip rear differential, you can still get stuck because this is not a locker and it'll spin just like the open differential. This time, I'm going to get in there and I'll give it a little bit of parking brake and see what happens.
Let's look at that again. Now the left rear wheel has some resistance because I'm holding the brake. The worm gears inside the torque sensing differential are turning and apply torque to the other side. The torque biasing ratio determines how much torque goes to the wheel that isn't slipping. The ratio comes from the number of teeth and angle of the helical-shaped gears inside the differential carrier. If the ratio is 3 and applying the brake makes it take 10 foot-pounds of torque to turn the left wheel, the right side will get 30 foot-pounds of torque. With the wheel in the air and no brake, it takes 0 torque to turn it, so the other side also gets 0 torque applied because 0 times 3 is still 0. I have the parking brake on and I'm dropping the clutch in gear to see if the differential moves. Let's take a look at the mount in slow motion. When you drop the clutch going forward, it squishes down. In reverse, the mount is pushed up. The video is playing 10% speed now. There is some movement, but a lot less than before. Back to the snow pile test. I have limited traction on the left rear wheel, and the differential transfers torque to the other side. Compare that to the open differential, and the wheel just spins. The TORSEN limited slip differential does much better in the snow. I just had to drive over the pile of snow again. Don't judge me, you would do it too. I found a parking lot with some deep slushy snow to test the RAV4. It just goes right through it and doesn't even think about getting stuck. I have BF Goodrich all-terrain TA-KO2 tires on here in 225/75 R16 size, and traction is great. I need to find a better spot with less kids running around so I can test the circles. Okay, this is better. Now, I'm not out here doing donuts in my car. Donuts are illegal. These are bagels. The RAV4 has a tendency to understeer. What that means is I turn the steering wheel all the way, but the car wants to go straight instead. I found the best way to get tight circles is start out slow, get the car turning, then floor it to break the back tires loose. The limited slip differential improves the bagels because you get both rear wheels spinning instead of just one sometimes. There was a record amount of snow in Utah this winter, so I drove through Emigration Canyon on the way back to check it out. Cars were buried in snow, and a few buildings collapsed from the weight of snow on top of them. There weren't any broken buildings in this video clip, but I did find a car. That was a nice drive. Let's head back to the garage for the conclusion to this video.
That limited slip rear differential is awesome. Unfortunately, it's about as rare as getting a match on Tinder that weighs less than the 3S FE engine. Alright, I have a challenge for you guys. Get on your computer and go to the website for your local junkyard. Find all the first generation RAV4s, then copy and paste the VINs into the Toyota vehicle specification website. Find out if any of them have the factory optional limited slip rear diff. If they do, go out there and go get it. I paid $125 for my limited slip rear differential, but it's worth $600 or more. Even if you don't want that part, just sell it to somebody else, pocket some money, and save these rare and awesome parts from the crusher. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.